old and useless. They called me that in my own house, my own son sitting at the dining room table right in front of the whole family. He said it without lowering his voice, without a speck of shame, and I just stood there staring at him. I didn't answer. I slowly kept chewing the bite of roast turkey and mashed potatoes I had in my mouth, pretending it hadn't hurt. But of course it hurt. It's not easy to swallow something like that. In that instant, I understood that there was no point in arguing. And the next day, with the first light entering through my bedroom window, I got up, grabbed my keys, called the locksmith, and changed every single lock in the house. The front door, the back door, the garage door, every single one. Without telling anyone, without raising my voice, without making a scene. Because in that silence, I already knew the one who didn't belong in this family wasn't me. It was them. Let me introduce myself. Because if you're going to listen to me, I at least want you to know the name of this old man who's talking to you. My name is Robert Martin. I was born in rural Montana 79 years ago, the son of farmers. From a young age, I learned to work with my hands. I was a construction laborer, then a foreman. I never got a fancy education, but I always had the will to provide for my family. I raised my children with what little I had, always putting their plate before my own. And now, after a lifetime of effort, they call me useless. That lunch was on a Sunday. We were all sitting there, my children, my grandchildren, even the caregiver who often looked at me with disdain. Those meals used to be a reason for celebration. Now they felt like an obligation. For weeks, I'd been noticing the strange atmosphere. Silences, looks that made me feel like I was in the way, even for opening the refrigerator. But that day was different. That day, the hints were over. My youngest son, the one I'd helped the most when he lost his job, spat the venom directly at me. Old and useless. And I repeat, it's not that it didn't hurt. Inside, I felt as if a concrete slab were crushing my chest. But I learned that sometimes silence is stronger than 1,000 shouts. That's why I didn't say anything. I finished eating, wiped my mouth, got up from the table, and went to my room. Sitting there on my bed, looking out the window at the gray Seattle sky, I thought all afternoon. I thought about everything I had done for them, and everything they no longer did for me. And then, in that silence, I made a decision that would change everything. That night, while everyone was sleeping, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to fall asleep. And when the sun came up, without saying a word, I went out onto the street. I walked to the neighborhood hardware store, Old Frank's, a longtime acquaintance. I asked him for the best locks he had, complete sets of new keys. He sold them to me without asking too many questions, with that look of someone who understands more than he says. I returned home slowly. I entered without making a sound. Everyone was still asleep. And there, in that dense silence, I started changing all the locks one by one with my own hands. Because if I still have anything left at 79 years old, it's the strength to do that. And dignity. When my son got up and saw me kneeling at the entrance, he couldn't help but ask, looking bewildered, "What are you doing, Dad?" I looked him in the eyes and answered him calmly, without altering my voice. "Nothing. Fixing what was broken." Because in this life, my son, there are things that, if you don't close them in time, end up completely shattered. The look on his face that day is something I'll never forget. His eyes were still half closed with sleep. But as soon as he saw me, with the screwdriver in my hand and the lock disassembled, the laziness instantly vanished. He didn't know whether to yell, approach, or be quiet. Finally, he asked again, but I repeated the same thing. I'm fixing what was broken. No need to add more, and he didn't have the nerve to insist either. Little by little, the rest of the family woke up. My grandchildren, who barely understood what was happening, looked at me curiously from the stairs. My other children, with that frightened look of someone who senses that something has changed but doesn't yet know how. And my daughter-in-law, always so clever at playing the victim, didn't even find the strength to pretend that morning. She remained motionless in the kitchen, with her cup of coffee in hand, without saying a word. When I finished with the last lock, I slowly stood up. I wiped my hands on an old rag. I looked around and, with all the calmness in the world, said aloud so everyone could hear, "From today on, whoever wants to enter this house will have to ask me. No more keys for everyone." The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared to reply, and deep down, I expected nothing less. Because even if the years weigh on you, and it seems like you no longer have the strength, the right to be respected is never lost. And if it has to be taught with actions, so be it. Long minutes passed, during which everyone went back to their own business. Some pretended that nothing was happening. Others were clearly annoyed. But I wasn't going to take a step back, not after everything I had endured. I sat down in my usual armchair, the one next to the dining room window. From there, I could see everything. The street, the yard, the entrance. I lit a cigarette, even though I know I shouldn't anymore because of my lung. And I stayed there thinking, remembering those years when we built this house with my own hands. Because we didn't buy it ready-made, no sir. We built it little by little, with savings, with effort, brick by brick, shingle by shingle. And to think that now they intended to make me feel like I was a bother in it. My son, the one who called me useless, came over after a while. He walked slowly, like someone who wants to apologize but doesn't dare. He stood in front of me and said, "Dad, was that really necessary?" I stared at him and answered calmly but firmly, "Do you think I enjoy having to do this? That I enjoy changing locks, deciding who I let in and who I don't? No, son. But there are things you don't do because you want to, but because you're forced to." He fell silent, lowered his eyes, and then, after a few seconds, I let out something I had been holding on to for years. "When you were little, tell me, how many times did I leave you or your siblings outside the house? How many times did I lock the door so you couldn't get in?" "Never," he responded in a low voice, without looking up. "Well, understand this. I'm doing it today because I have no other choice." It wasn't a long conversation. It didn't need to be. He went back to the others, and I remained seated, looking out the window at the streets of Seattle that I know by heart. The same facades, the same faces of neighbors. Only now, everything seemed different. During the day, there were no big arguments or shouts. Each person found their corner. Some took refuge in their phones, others locked themselves in their rooms. But I knew the comments would start soon. And they did. In the afternoon, while sweeping the patio, I heard low voices in the kitchen discussing, "What are we going to do now, Dad? He's gone crazy. What if he calls a lawyer?" They thought I couldn't hear. But with age, you sharpen your ear for what matters. That night during dinner, a strange silence reigned. No one dared to look me in the face, and instead of feeling bad, I experienced something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Because after swallowing so much in silence, I had finally set a boundary. I had finally made it clear that I am not something to be pushed aside when I stop being useful. When dinner was over, I got up, went to my room, and before lying down, I took out an old notebook that I always keep in the drawer. There I have noted the important things: names, dates, documents. I started reviewing, and almost without realizing it, I remembered something essential. The house was still in my name. I had never changed the deed, nor had I put anyone else as an owner. And that very night, I made an even bigger decision. I'll talk about that later because the story hadn't ended yet. When the first ray of sun timidly began to sneak through my bedroom window, I was already awake, sitting in my armchair by the window with the same black coffee I've been preparing for decades. I barely slept that night, but not out of nervousness. No, it was because I had already decided. Something bigger than changing locks. That was already done. Now, it was time for the next step, to make things clear once and for all, so that what happened that Sunday at the dining room table would never be repeated. While sipping the coffee, I looked at the neighborhood. The same trees, the same streets of Seattle, but with a different outlook. Because when you make real decisions, everything looks different, more serene, with less internal noise. There was no anger in my chest, nor sadness, only that firmness that appears when you seem to have no strength left, but still find it. At 8 o'clock, I slowly got up, went to the closet, and took out a large, yellowed envelope, where I keep all my important papers, deeds, receipts, letters. What I needed was there, the deed to the house in my name, signed more than 40 years ago, and another paper, a phone number written down a long time ago, which I had never wanted to use until that day. The contact for an attorney, an old acquaintance, one of those who still respect older men. I put the envelope inside my jacket, put on my hat, and went out onto the street without making a sound, while everyone was still asleep. I walked calmly, unhurriedly, but with determination. The office wasn't far, just a few blocks up the main avenue. The attorney, Mr. Ramirez, greeted me with a smile. He had known me for years, from when I helped him fix a piece of furniture in his house. "Mr. Martin, what a surprise. What brings you here so early?" he said, offering me a seat. I didn't beat around the bush. I took out the envelope and put it on his desk. "Ramirez, I want to get all this in order. I want to make sure that when I'm gone, things are done as they should be. And while I'm here, that no one takes away what is mine." He calmly reviewed the documents and replied, "Everything is well preserved, Mr. Martin. Do you wish to make a will or a legal restriction?" "Both," I told him without hesitation. "More than the will, Ramirez," I told the lawyer. "I want it to be clear from today that this house cannot be sold, mortgaged, or touched without my signature and authorization." He nodded slowly and began to prepare the papers, asking me for documents and details. In the meantime, I told him what had happened at my house. I didn't give names, there was no need. I just explained that my own son had forgotten what respect means, and that I wasn't going to allow that to become a habit. We were there for almost an hour, reading, signing, putting in order what had been saved for years, and when I left the office with the documents under my arm, I felt, how to put it, as if an enormous weight had been lifted off me, because now it was no longer just a matter of pride. Now it was a matter of law. I walked back slowly through the streets of Seattle, greeting neighbors who looked at me curiously. By then it was mid-morning. Opening the door with my new keys, I saw that everyone was awake, moving between the living room and the kitchen. Some watched me in silence as I entered. Others pretended they hadn't seen me. I wasn't in the mood for arguments. I went to the dining room, left the envelope with the papers on the table, and raised my voice. "I want you all to sit down for a moment. I have something to say." Little by little, they arrived, some looking grumpy, others intrigued. My son, the one who had called me useless, was the last to appear. When everyone was seated, I also sat down with my hat in my hand and spoke slowly, like someone recounting something weighty. I know these days have been strange, and maybe some of you think I overreacted by changing the locks. But I want you to understand once and for all. I built this house with my own hands. It took me years, sweat, sacrifices, and as of today, it is still in my name. I paused and continued. Today, I was with a lawyer, and I signed documents to make it clearer than ever. No one will be able to sell, move, or decide anything about this house except me. And when I'm gone, things will be divided as that paper says, not as you imagine. I saw how glances were exchanged, how murmurs ran. Some protested in low voices, others were silent. And I'll tell you something else, I added. Respect is not bought or inherited, it is earned. If you respect me, this will continue to be your house. If not, you know where the door is, and I have the keys. There were no shouts or arguments, just that dense silence that remains when someone speaks without mincing words. My son lowered his head, my daughter-in-law crossed her arms, and my poor grandchildren barely understood. I got up, collected the envelope, and before returning to my armchair, I finished with a simple phrase, without raising my voice. I prefer to be alone in my house than to be accompanied while feeling like a burden. So, you decide. And I left them with their thoughts. Because sometimes the best way to teach is by example, not with empty words. But of course, that doesn't mean everything was resolved immediately. Some things, even if you say them out loud, take a long time to sink in. What happened after that day was, shall we say, another story. The following days were quieter on the outside, but not on the inside. The house felt different. The forced laughter and the heavy jokes from my children were gone. It was as if everyone were walking on eggshells, being careful not to anger me. As if they knew that this time, I had set a real boundary. And I confess something. I didn't like that feeling. I didn't do it out of pride, but out of necessity. Because you can be a good father, a good grandfather, a good person. But a time comes when, if you don't demand respect, they walk all over you. Every morning, I continued with my usual routine. I woke up early, prepared my black coffee, sat in the armchair by the window. From there, I watched the neighbors go by, greeted those who recognized me, and thought. I thought a lot. I thought about everything I had lived through, how hard I had worked to build that house, how I had gotten to that point. Sometimes, I wondered at what moment the respect between father and son had broken. Because it wasn't always like this. When my boys were little, they looked at me as if I were the strongest man in the world. But years and circumstances change people, and not always for the better. One afternoon, while sweeping the patio, my youngest granddaughter approached me. She had that serious face of someone who wants to ask something but doesn't dare. Without looking directly at her, I kept sweeping and said, "Tell me, sweetheart. Don't keep the doubt to yourself." She was silent for a moment, and then she asked me, "Grandpa, why did you change the keys?" That question hit me gently, but firmly. Because I understood that for children, things aren't always as clear as they are for us adults. I bent down a little, leaning on the broom handle, and answered her. Because sometimes, for adults to understand, you have to do things that seem strange. But it's so they don't forget that respect comes first. She nodded her head without saying anything else. And in her eyes, I swear, I saw something I hadn't seen in anyone's eyes in that house for a long time. Genuine affection. Not pity. Not obligation. affection. 2 weeks passed like this, without major conflicts, but with that tension floating in the air. I still had my papers saved, my things in order. I didn't leave anything in sight, because I had already learned not to fully trust, not even my own family. Because when you get older, you learn to see things you didn't want to see before. Like those glances between my children, those coded gestures, as if they were communicating without words, planning something. Perhaps thinking about how to sort out the house, my things, without me realizing it. Until one day, one of them approached me with a paper in his hand. It was my eldest son, the quietest of them all. But that day he had a serious expression. He sat down in front of me and said, "Dad, I've been thinking, wouldn't it be better to get everything settled so there won't be problems later?" I looked at him intently. I knew exactly what he meant. And without losing my composure, I replied, "And why are you worried about that now, when it never mattered to you before?" He lowered his gaze. "Because we're not so young anymore, Dad. I don't want there to be trouble between my siblings later." I took a sip of my coffee, looked at him again, and answered, "That's already settled, son. I've been to the lawyer. Everything is written and signed. There won't be problems because things will be done as I left them arranged." He clenched the paper he had in his hand, but didn't say anything else. He got up and left, looking serious. And staying there alone again, I understood that it wasn't just a matter of respect. It was that time had passed, and I was still determined to take care of what was mine, because no one else was going to do it for me. That same night, while everyone was sleeping, I got up. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood there observing the house in silence. Every corner had something of mine, my effort, my history. And although it might seem like just any dwelling to others, to me, it was much more than walls and a roof. I promised myself that I would not let anything or anyone take it away from me. And if I ever had to leave, it would be because I decided to, not because they threw me out. What I didn't know was that the decision I made weeks ago to change the locks and put things in order was going to bring unexpected consequences. Because children, when they feel displaced, don't always react calmly. And I would discover that very soon. No one needed to tell me. I already sensed it in the air. It wasn't just the silence, nor those glances from my children behind my back. It was the way they lowered their tone of voice when I entered the room, or how they suddenly locked themselves in their rooms with the phone glued to their ear. You don't need to be a fortune teller to know when something is being plotted in your own house. And I'll say it with my hand on my heart. I wasn't surprised. Because when you stop serving your children as they expect, they stop seeing you as a father and start looking at you as a hindrance. And I, no matter how much it hurt to think about it, had already accepted it. It was a Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting in my usual armchair with the window open, looking out at the street. The sunlight was beginning to fall, casting those long shadows that I like so much, because they remind me that the day is ending. But there is still some life left before nightfall. Suddenly, my youngest son approached me, the same one who had uttered that cruel phrase at the table, the same one who had looked at me as if I were an old piece of furniture. He sat down in front of me with his hands clasped and his eyes fixed on the floor. "Dad," he said with that voice used by those who don't know how to begin, "we've been talking with my brothers." I didn't answer him. I continued looking out the window as if it had nothing to do with me, because I already knew where this was going. "And we think it would be better," he continued, "if you went to a place where they can take better care of you. You know, a place for older people with nurses and doctors." At that instant, I slowly lowered my gaze and faced him directly, without haste, without anger. "A nursing home?" I asked, as if I didn't understand. "It's not because we don't want you here, Dad. It's for your own good," he dared to say, raising his face. I held his gaze for a long time until I took a deep breath and answered him with the calmest voice I could find. "And do you already have the place chosen?" He shrugged. He didn't expect me to react like this. "We're looking at options, yes." At that moment, I understood everything. It wasn't just a matter of them wanting me out. It was a matter of papers, of money, of keeping what was mine. I thought, if they think I'm going to leave this house just like that, they don't know me. But I didn't say anything else. I slowly got up from the armchair with my usual calm and headed to the kitchen. I opened the drawer where I kept the new keys, the ones only I had. I held them for a few seconds, felt their weight in my hand, and then put them away again. I knew the time to act was approaching. That night, I didn't have dinner with them. I closed my bedroom door and stayed there in silence, reviewing my life from the day I laid the first brick of this house to the moment I named each of my children. I asked myself if I had ever been unfair to them, and I always came to the same conclusion. I did the best I could with what I had. In the morning, when the sun was barely rising, I got up earlier than ever. I put on my light blue shirt, the one I save for important moments, and went out for a walk in the neighborhood. I passed the hardware store, greeted old Frank, and bought a big padlock, one of those that can't be opened with anything. I returned before they woke up. I closed the door, making sure everything was in place, and sat down again in my armchair, waiting for them to start coming out of their rooms one by one. I saw the surprise on their faces to see me there, dressed, ready, as if nothing were wrong. My youngest son was the first to speak. "Dad, have you thought about it?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, I've thought about it, and I've decided that I won't be going to any nursing home." He pressed his lips together, annoyed. But before he could say anything else, I raised my hand. "And I've also made another decision." I got up from the armchair, took the padlock out of my pocket, and held it up high so everyone could see it. "From now on, this house will be locked with this. Whoever doesn't respect, whoever doesn't understand that a father is not thrown out here like garbage, leaves, and doesn't come back in." A thick silence fell. No one moved. I walked to the main door, placed the padlock on the gate, and locked it. "This is how things are done, children," I told them, while putting the keys in my pocket. Not with shouts, not with insults, but with actions. And there it remained, in silence. No one knew how to answer. No one dared to argue, because at that moment, they understood that the useless old man still had firm hands to close a door and not open it again. Since that morning when I put the padlock on the door, the atmosphere in the house changed completely. It was no longer the uncomfortable silence from before. Now there was something else. A tension that could be cut with a knife. My children were still there, yes, but they walked as if they were stepping on broken glass, being careful not to provoke me. I, sitting in my usual armchair looking out the window, felt that finally there was order where it was needed. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't anger. It was respect. And if I had to prove that this house was still mine to remind them, I would do it as many times as necessary. One afternoon, while cleaning my old shotgun, I keep it just as a souvenir, nothing more. One of my sons approached me, not the youngest, but the middle one. He sat silently beside me, looking at the floor, until he finally murmured, "Dad, I think we went too far." I didn't answer immediately. I kept wiping the barrel as if what he had just said wasn't important. But inside something moved. Because even if you want to pretend to be made of steel, even if you say you don't need anyone, you are still a father. And for a son to admit something like that is no small thing. When I finished wiping, I put the shotgun back in its place, locked the cabinet, and returned to the armchair. Only then did I look him in the eyes. "And why do you say that now?" I asked him. He shrugged. "Because we talked about it among ourselves. And I think we didn't appreciate everything you did for us, Dad." His words sounded sincere. I noticed it, but I also understood that not everyone in the house thought the same. Because while one spoke like this, the others continued to look at me as if I were a bother or something that was only there because they hadn't yet found a way to get rid of me. I simply replied, "I'm glad you understand, but that doesn't change anything. The rules are already set." He remained silent. He got up and left, and I was left alone again with my coffee next to me, thinking about how I had reached this point, because it's not easy to get old and realize that you have to set boundaries for your own children. But sometimes it's the only way to keep things from spiraling out of control. That same night, after dinner, I reviewed the papers again calmly. I took out the envelope where I kept the deed to the house, the lawyer's signatures, everything in order. I wanted to be sure that if they ever came up with weird ideas, I would have everything ready to defend what was mine. My hand didn't tremble as I did it. It was pure precaution, like checking the deadbolts before bed. But what I didn't expect was what happened the next day. Because at dawn, while I was making coffee, I heard a noise at the entrance. I approached and saw one of my sons, precisely the youngest one, trying to force the padlock with a tool. He didn't see me immediately. I stayed in the kitchen doorway, watching him in silence, waiting. And when he realized I was there, he froze. "What are you doing?" I asked in a low but firm voice. He turned around with a tense face and at first didn't know what to say. "Nothing, Dad. I was just checking." I didn't let him finish the excuse. I approached slowly with my hands in my pockets and spoke to him face to face, my gaze fixed on his. "You don't need to explain it. I know what you're doing, and I'm going to tell you only once. Whoever wants to stay here does so by respecting my rules. Whoever doesn't takes their things and leaves. It's that simple." He lowered his head, but didn't respond. He put the tool in his pocket and slowly entered the house. I stood there in front of the gate, my heart tight but firm. Because sometimes, even if it hurts, you have to show that you are still the owner of your house. That same afternoon, after what had happened, I made an even more forceful decision. I called the lawyer, Mr. Ramirez, again. I asked him to come to the house. I needed to put everything in writing in an even clearer way. And when he arrived, I explained calmly, "I want a notarized deed to be drawn up stating that as long as I live, this house is mine, non-transferable and untouchable, and that any attempt to remove me from here or change anything without my permission will be considered illegal." Ramirez took note of everything. He drafted the document right there in the dining room. While my children watched from the hallway in silence, they knew they couldn't do anything anymore. We signed the deed. I signed it. And when the lawyer left, I sat back down in my armchair with my head held high, because that was the last piece I needed to feel at peace. But of course, you can never trust everything to papers. And what happened a few days later showed me that even if you put up all the legal obstacles, some things are only resolved with character, with presence, with the right word. Several days passed, during which the house remained in a tense silence, as if everyone was waiting to see who would dare to break it first. I continued with my usual routine, waking up early, preparing my black coffee, calmly sweeping the patio, checking the potted plants by the window. And although everything looked the same on the outside, I knew that something was moving on the inside. Because after the padlock and the lawyer, none of my children had said another word to me. But I'm not naive. You can get old, lose hair, lose strength in your hands. But your mind, if you take care of it, keeps working. And I noticed their movements, their outings, their calls, those unexpected visitors who entered without greeting me, as if I were invisible in my own house. One morning, while I was on the patio cleaning the dust off my old radio, I heard my middle son talking on the phone in the kitchen. I didn't get closer, but from where I was, I heard him. Clearly, he was talking about papers, about doing the paperwork as soon as possible, before it gets more complicated. And then I confirmed it. They weren't going to leave things alone. Even though I had signed with the lawyer, they were still looking for a way to keep what was mine, to kick me out of my place. That same afternoon, I decided to do something I had postponed for too long. I left the house with my keys and the padlock in my pocket and went directly to the county recorder's office downtown. I carried the envelope with all my papers, the already signed documents, in my hand. When I arrived, I spoke with the main notary, an older man who already knew me from when I bought the land where I built the house. I explained the situation without embellishment. My children are looking for a way to take what is mine. I want to tie everything down even more. I want written proof that this house belongs to me until the last day I breathe. And that if they try to move a single paper without my permission, they'll get into serious legal trouble. The notary understood immediately. The notary had me sign an additional document, a kind of sworn declaration, and archived a copy in his office. When I finished, I left there with my mind somewhat calmer, because it was no longer just words between family. Now, the law was on my side so that no one could twist it to their liking. Upon returning home, I found them all gathered in the living room. I don't know if it was a coincidence or if they were already waiting for me. I put my papers away in the bedroom and sat down in my usual armchair. Then the youngest one got up, and looking at me with a mixture of nervousness and anger, said loudly, "Dad, we need to talk." I gestured for him to continue. And right there in front of everyone, he let out what I had already imagined. That they had talked to a lawyer on their own. That they wanted to make a transfer. That they were saying I was no longer in a condition to handle things alone. As he spoke, I saw some of my other children nodding, as if they all shared the same plan. I waited for him to finish. And when there was finally silence, I slowly got up, leaning with both hands on the arms of the armchair. I looked at them one by one, unhurriedly, and told them in a firm and clear voice, without needing to yell, "You think that because I have white hair and walk slower, I don't understand anything anymore. You think you can decide for me, that you can play at being owners of what you didn't build? Well, you are wrong. I may be old, yes, but I'm not foolish. I've already arranged everything, and I'm warning you now. If anyone tries to move a paper or change anything without my permission, you'll have to deal with the law and with me." The silence was so great that you could hear the hum of the refrigerator. No one dared to say anything, not even the youngest one who had started everything. And instead of sitting back down, I walked to the door, took the padlock out of my pocket, and placed it back on the gate, locking it forcefully. Then, with the keys in my hand, I turned to them and added, "From today on, whoever wants to enter or leave will do so under my conditions, and whoever doesn't agree can leave. I am old, yes, but I still have the strength to close this door myself." And so I did. I left the house locked from the inside with the padlock on. I returned to my armchair, turned on my old radio, and stayed there listening to music from other times. while the others dispersed in silence, because right there, at that moment, they understood that the grandfather, the supposedly useless old man, was still the owner of his house, and that as long as I breathed, no one was going to kick me out of what was mine. But even so, something told me that the story was not over, because when pride gets into people's hearts, there is always one more move, and I was ready for whatever came. Because when money gets involved, when ambition gets into people's hearts, respect is no longer the same. And I'm going to tell you something. No matter how much you raised them, fed them, took them to the doctor when they were little, children sometimes forget. They forget too quickly. It was a Thursday morning. I remember it well because on Thursdays, I always liked to clean the patio. That day, I was sweeping while the sun was still low when I heard a strange noise at the gate. At first I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. I approached slowly and saw a man who wasn't family forcing the padlock with a tool. A young stranger with a baseball cap and dark sunglasses. He hadn't seen me. I stood still, watching him from the porch until he looked up and froze when he saw me there with the broom in my hand. "Who are you?" I asked without raising my voice. The man didn't answer. He dropped the tool, took a step back, and at that instant, I saw my youngest son come out from the side of the house. I saw it clearly. His face was pale, looking at me as if I had caught him in a sin. "What's going on here?" I asked again, this time looking directly at him. He stammered, scratched his neck, and finally said nervously, "He's a friend. He just came to help me change the padlock." That's when I understood everything. He was no friend. He had brought him to try to kick me out of my own house, to break the padlock and enter without asking permission. "So, we've come to this, son," I replied. At that moment, I felt something in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was a cold certainty, one of those that hurt but don't make you cry. "So, we've come to this," I said without moving. "Bringing strangers into your own father's house to force a door." He lowered his head. The man left almost running, leaving the tool lying on the ground. I bent down, calmly picked it up, and handed it to my son. "Take it," I said, "and listen to me well. The next time you try something like this, I'm not going to talk. I'm going to call the police, and that will be the end of the matter." He didn't answer anything. He took the tool and went in silently. I stayed there for a while longer, my heart beating slowly, looking at the gate. The key was still in my pocket, and it was going to stay there as long as I breathed. That same afternoon, after what had happened, I decided that it wasn't enough to be alone with the anger. I picked up the phone, called Mr. Ramirez, the lawyer, and asked him to come again. When he arrived, I told him everything that had happened, detail by detail. He listened to me seriously and finally said, "Mr. Martin, this is no longer a simple family quarrel. This is something else. If you want, we can file a complaint and notify the authorities." I thought about it for a moment, looking at my hands. They are not as strong as they used to be, but they can still write, still sign. "Do it," I replied. "I want everything in writing, and if necessary, I want them to come here to the house. Let my children understand that this is no longer a game." That same night, I signed the document, and the next day, 2 officers arrived at the house accompanied by the lawyer. It wasn't a scandal. There was no need. They entered, took note, and left the notification posted on the main door. An official document that stated that the property could not be interfered with without the express authorization of the owner. And that owner was me. When my children saw it, some were angry, others kept silent, but none dared to say anything to my face. I sat down in my usual armchair, turned on the radio, and continued with my life. Because at this point, the only thing that mattered to me was having peace. Not revenge, not quarrels, just peace. That night, as I looked out the window at the starry sky, I thought about how everything had changed. How I went from being the father who took care of them, who fed them, to the old man who bothers them. And I understood that, as painful as it is, it can happen to anyone. But I also understood something else. You only lose what you don't defend. And I was not willing to lose anything else. Although it seemed that chapter was closed, there was still one detail that would put everything in its place, a detail that not even my own children expected. Because sometimes, when you think you've seen it all, life makes one last turn. The following days, with the visits from the officers, an almost absolute silence reigned in the house. There was no laughter or arguments. Not even the television was on. Everyone went about their business, walking slowly, as if that house were no longer the same. And in part, it was true. It was no longer the place where everyone did what they wanted. Now the one making the rules was me. And I'm going to tell you one thing. It's not easy to get old and have to impose respect by force. But sometimes there is no other option. One afternoon, while sweeping the patio with the same care as always, one of my grandsons approached me, the eldest one. He must have been around 20 years old, tall, thin, with that look of someone who still doesn't know where he stands in life. He stayed by my side for a while without saying a word, and after a moment, he dropped something on me that I didn't expect. "Grandpa, they say you shouldn't live alone anymore." I leaned my hands on the broom handle, looked at him slowly, and asked him, "And what do you think?" He lowered his head. "I don't know. I'm just repeating what I heard." I held his gaze for a moment longer and answered him calmly. "You can be surrounded by people and still be alone, son. The important thing is not how many people are in the house, but who truly respects you." He nodded as if he understood something for the first time, and left me alone with my thoughts again. But that same night, something happened that I didn't expect. I was already in bed with the radio on low volume when I heard a loud bang at the front door. I got up slowly, unhurriedly, grabbed my cane, just in case, and went out into the hallway. I saw shadows moving outside, low voices. Then I understood. They were trying to get in again. But this time, it wasn't sneaking around. This time, it was head-on. I didn't turn on the light. I stayed there in silence, waiting. Suddenly, the door burst open with a slam. They had broken the lock. Two of my sons entered, the youngest and the middle one, with tense faces, as if they had come to do something they could no longer stop. "What are you doing?" I asked in the dark. They stopped, surprised to see me standing there without fear. The youngest spoke first. "Dad, this can't continue. You can't keep all of us locked up. This house belongs to everyone." I felt something inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pain. It was a cold, firm calm. The calm of someone who already knows exactly what they have to do. "To everyone?" I replied, taking a step toward them. "To everyone? Or mine?" They looked at each other without finding words. Then I added, "Tomorrow you'll have a surprise, and I assure you, you won't like it." I turned around, returned to my room, locked the door, and lay down as if nothing had happened, because the time had come to make the final move, the definitive one. And this time, there would be no turning back. The next morning, I woke up before the sun came out. I didn't need a clock. The cold air coming through the window already told me it was early. I sat on the edge of the bed, placed my feet on the floor calmly, and before getting up, I opened the drawer where I kept the keys and the envelope with the lawyer's papers. I understood the night before when my own children forced the door. It was no longer just a matter of respect. It was a matter of dignity. And if there was something I wasn't going to lose in this life, even if I was left completely alone, it was that. My dignity. With the envelope under my arm and the keys in my pocket, I went out determined to prove it. I put on my light blue shirt, the one I always save for important days. I went down to the kitchen, made myself a black coffee as I do every morning, and drank it unhurriedly, looking out the window as the sky began to lighten. Then I grabbed my cane, my hat, and left the house, locking the door behind me. This time, I didn't go to the hardware store or the county recorder's office. I went directly to the county deeds office. There, with the lawyer waiting for me, we signed the papers he had already prepared the day before. The formal sale of the house, but not to my children, nor to anyone in the family. To a third party, a trusted man, Mr. Ramirez himself, who paid the fair price and had no interest in living there, only in the investment in the land. When everything was signed and sealed, I left there with a serene heart. It was no longer my house, but it wouldn't be theirs either. And I'm going to tell you something that might sound cold. It didn't hurt, because that house had long ceased to be the home I built with my hands. Now it was just walls where no respect remained. I returned near noon. I opened the door with the key for the last time. My children were sitting in the living room, waiting for me. I looked at them one by one, unhurriedly, and told them, "This will be the last time I enter through this door. The house is no longer mine. I have sold it." I watched their faces change color. Some jumped up. Others remained motionless, not understanding. "How do you mean you sold it?" the youngest one asked, almost shouting. "Just as you hear it," I replied, leaning on my cane. "The house no longer belongs to us. In a few weeks, you will have to look for another place to live." The silence that followed cannot be described in words. It was as if time had stopped, and I simply approached the table, left the keys on top, next to the empty envelope, and added, "I gave you my whole life. I raised you, I cared for you, I defended you. And even so, you called me old and useless. You treated me as if I was worthless. Now it's my turn to decide, and I decide to start over." I calmly put on my hat and turned toward the door. I opened it, and before leaving, I paused for a second to say one last thing. I'd rather sleep under a tree than live in a house where I'm no longer respected. And with that, I left. I walked slowly down the street without looking back. I knew it was the end of one story and the beginning of another, because it's never too late to rewrite your own path, even with a cane in one hand and a heart that is a little tired. And to support this channel, subscribe here and share this video. Every day, you will find a new story, and who knows, maybe one will resemble yours too. Because it is never too late to learn, reflect, and start over, even at 79 years old in Montana.